Chris Harman, How Marxism Works. Section: The Class Struggle and the State. The workers have rarely accepted their lot without fighting back. There were slave revolts in ancient Egypt and Rome, peasant revolts in imperial China, civil wars between the rich and poor in the cities of ancient Greece, in Rome and Renaissance Europe. That is why Karl Marx began his pamphlet, The Communist Manifesto, by insisting, quote, "The history of all hitherto existing societies has been the history of class struggles." The growth of civilization had depended upon the exploitation of one class by another, and therefore on the struggle between them. However powerful an Egyptian pharaoh, a Roman emperor, or a medieval prince, however luxurious their lives, however magnificent their palaces, they could do nothing unless they guaranteed that the products grown by the most miserable peasant or slave passed into their possession. They could only do this if alongside the division into classes, there also grew something else: control over the means of violence by themselves and their supporters. In earlier societies, there had been no army, police, or governmental apparatus separate from the majority of the people. Even some 50 or 60 years ago, for instance, in parts of Africa, it was still possible to find societies in which this was still so. Many of the tasks done by the state in our society were simply done informally by the whole population, or by meetings of representatives. Such meetings would judge the behavior of any individual who was considered to have broken an important social rule. Punishment would be applied by the whole community, for instance, by forcing miscreants to leave. Since everyone was agreed on the necessary punishment, separate police were not needed to put it into effect. If warfare occurred, all the young men would take part, under leaders chosen for the occasion, again, without any separate army structure. But once you had a society in which the minority had control over most of the wealth, these simple ways of keeping law and order and organizing warfare could no longer work. Any meeting of representatives, or any gathering of the armed young men, would be likely to be split among class lines. The privileged group could only survive if it began to monopolize in its own hands the making and implementation of punishments, laws, the organization of armies, the production of weapons. So the separation into classes was accompanied by the growth of groups of judges, policemen, and secret policemen, generals, bureaucrats, all of whom were given part of the wealth in the hands of the privileged class in return for protecting its rule. Those who served in the ranks of this state were trained to obey without hesitation the orders of their superiors, and were cut off from all normal social ties with the exploited mass of people. The state developed as a killing machine in the hands of the privileged class, and a highly effective machine it could be. Of course, the generals who ran this machine often fell out with a particular emperor or king, and tried to put themselves in his place. The ruling class, having armed a monster, could often not control it. But since the wealth needed to keep the killing machine running came from the exploitation of the working masses, every such revolt would be followed by continuation of society along the old lines. Throughout history, people who have really wanted to change society for the better have found themselves up against not just the privileged class, but also an armed machine, a state that serves its interests. Ruling classes, together with the priests, generals, policemen, and legal systems that back them up, all grew up in the first place because without them civilization could not develop. But once they are established in power, they come to have an interest in hindering the further development of civilization. Their power is dependent upon their ability to force those who produce wealth to hand it over to them. They become wary of new ways of producing wealth, even if more efficient than the old, lest control escape from their hands. They fear anything that could lead to the exploited masses developing initiative and independence. And they also fear the growth of new privileged groups with enough wealth to be able to pay for arms and armies of their own. Beyond a certain point, instead of aiding the development of production, they began to hinder it. For example, in the Chinese Empire, the power of the ruling class rested upon its ownership of the land and its control over the canals and dams that were necessary for irrigation and to avoid floods. This control laid the basis for a civilization that lasted some 2,000 years. But at the end of this period, production was not much more advanced than at the beginning, despite the flourishing of Chinese art, the discovery of printing and gunpowder, all at a time when Europe was stuck in the Dark Ages. The reason was that when new forms of production did begin to develop, it was in towns, through the initiative of merchants and craftsmen. The ruling class feared this growth in power of a social grouping that was not completely under its control. So periodically, the imperial authorities took harsh measures to crush the growing economies of the towns, to drive production down, and to destroy the power of the new social classes. The growth of new forces of production, of new ways of producing wealth, clashed with the interests of the old ruling class. A struggle developed, the outcome of which determined the whole future of society. Sometimes the outcome, as in China, was that new forms of production were prevented from emerging, and society remained more or less stagnant for very long periods of time. Sometimes, as in the Roman Empire, the inability of new forms of production to develop meant that eventually there was no longer enough wealth being produced to maintain society on its old basis. Civilization collapsed, the cities were destroyed, and people reverted to a crude, agricultural form of society. Sometimes a new class, based upon a new form of production, was able to organize to weaken and finally overthrow the old ruling class, together with its legal system, its armies, its ideology, its religion. Then society could go forward. In each case, whether the society went forward or backwards depended on who won the war between the classes. And, as in any war, victory was not ordained in advance, but depended on the organization, cohesion, and leadership of the rival classes. End of section.